"Ma'am, step away from the woman, and keep your hands visible." That was the first thing my wife Sarah heard while tying her shoelace on our front lawn that morning. She looked up, half confused, half amused, to find two patrol officers with hands on their holsters, staring straight at her like she was about to rob a bank. She stood up slowly, calm as a breeze, wearing her old joggers, a hoodie, and a legally holstered sidearm on her hip. One of the cops looked nervous. The other was on the radio, calling in something. The moment he said the words "suspect is armed female possible threat neighborhood complaint," the first officer's eyes flicked to the badge clipped casually to Sarah's waistband. And then the panic kicked in. Not from Sarah. From the officers. They stepped back instantly like they'd seen a ghost. One of them stammered, "Chief Bennett." "Wait, you're Chief Sarah Bennett? Oh my God." Meanwhile, just across the street, with a smug expression plastered across her face, was Karen Franklin, the HOA president, clutching her little dog in one hand and her phone in the other. She whispered into it like she was giving play-by-play commentary. She had no idea the woman she just falsely accused of being a gun-wielding maniac was not only a cop but the new chief of police. And she had just committed a felony. This insanity didn't just start that morning. The tension had been building for months. Karen had been on a personal crusade to turn our peaceful suburban street into her own little dictatorship. Ever since she got elected HOA president for the third time running, thanks to a suspiciously low voter turnout and a conveniently timed barbecue bribe, she had been throwing around fines like confetti. Grass too long, $25. Kids chalk on sidewalk, $50. Holiday lights still up after New Year's, $100. But her latest obsession was a self-made rule about visible firearms. She claimed it made people uncomfortable. Never mind that we live in a state where open carry is legal, and Sarah's presence made everyone feel safer, especially after the string of burglaries last fall. Karen didn't care. What she saw wasn't protection. It was a challenge to her authority. 2 days before the incident, Karen stormed into our yard uninvited, while Sarah was oiling her garden tools, and flatly declared that she would be fined $500 a day for wearing a weapon in public view. Sarah calmly explained that not only was she off duty and well within her rights, but that the HOA had no legal standing to regulate personal firearm visibility. Karen scoffed and said that might be true for civilians, but I expected better from someone in your position. You're supposed to set an example, not look like you're ready for a gunfight. Sarah smiled politely and said, "I am setting an example, Karen. One that respects the law instead of making it up on the fly." Karen left in a huff, but not before yelling, "I'll fix this." And she did. Or at least she thought she did by calling 911 2 days later, as soon as Sarah stepped outside with her holster on. The officers who responded to the call were clearly shaken once they realized who she was. One of them practically apologized mid-sentence. "Chief, we had no idea. Dispatch just said possible armed woman, and the HOA president insisted it was urgent." Sarah nodded and said, "You were just doing your job. But now I have to do mine." Karen was still standing there, confused as to why her big dramatic bust wasn't playing out the way she imagined. Sarah walked over with calm authority and said, "Karen, you filed a false police report about an armed threat. That's a serious crime." Karen blinked rapidly and squeaked, "I didn't know it was you. I mean, you weren't in uniform. How was I supposed to know you were the chief? You could have been anyone with a gun." Sarah replied, "That's exactly why you don't call in armed threat alerts on people without verifying. You put your neighbors at risk. You put officers at risk. And you're going to answer for that." That same evening our doorbell rang, and it wasn't just one neighbor, it was 6 of them. They brought over brownies, a pie, and a case of soda, and said collectively, "We saw everything. That woman is insane. What can we do to help?" The outpouring of support was unexpected and deeply touching. Sarah never liked the spotlight. Even after her promotion, she tried to stay low-key. But now the whole neighborhood saw her as what she really was, a protector with patience, steel nerves, and zero tolerance for bullies. But Karen wasn't done. The next day she posted a neighborhood newsletter accusing Sarah of threatening her with a weapon. She claimed she felt unsafe and that Sarah's presence was, quote, divisive. She even hinted that Sarah might be misusing her power. Sarah didn't respond publicly. Instead, she called the city attorney's office and submitted a formal complaint citing harassment and misuse of HOA authority. She also forwarded the 911 call transcript and her bodycam footage, which she wore even off-duty now after years of dealing with unhinged accusations. Later that week, the city council quietly scheduled a closed-door meeting with Sarah to discuss what had happened. She laid everything out: the footage, the harassment, the unofficial policies Karen had been trying to enforce. She even revealed anonymous letters some neighbors had received warning them not to associate with certain people, all traced back to HOA mailers. The council was shocked. One of the members said, "I thought the HOA was just about landscaping and community events. I didn't know it had turned into a regime." Meanwhile, Karen was still strutting around as if she had won. She hosted an emergency HOA meeting to propose a ban on visible weapons and tried to quote her own 911 call as proof. But this time the residents pushed back. One man named Greg, who usually never spoke up, raised his hand and said, "You lied to the police about our neighbor, who happens to be the police chief. You endangered everyone. You're lucky we're not voting you out tonight." Karen turned red but kept pushing until even her vice president started distancing himself. He whispered something to her mid-meeting and her face froze. That was the first sign she knew she might be losing control. But Karen wasn't someone who gave up easily. She believed she was right because being wrong would crack her porcelain ego. She started digging deeper, making phone calls, trying to get dirt on Sarah. She even tried to contact a reporter at the local paper to leak the story. What she didn't realize was that the reporter she called had a teenage son who had once been saved from a house fire by Sarah. That call didn't go the way she planned. And still, through all of this, Sarah kept calm, focused, and professional. She didn't retaliate. She didn't grandstand. She just did what she had always done: lead with grace and strength. But beneath that calm surface, I knew she was preparing. Not just for justice, but for a reckoning Karen couldn't see coming. Not yet. But it was close. And when it landed, it would shake this HOA to its overpriced core. In the days that followed the false 911 call, the neighborhood buzzed like a hornet's nest. Everyone had seen or heard about what happened, and Karen's once iron-fisted grip over the HOA began to slip. People started whispering openly about her abuse of power, questioning how someone so quick to make false accusations could still be in charge of anything. But Karen wasn't retreating. She was doubling down. Her next move was a glossy, full-color newsletter titled "Restoring Safety and Decency to Our Streets." It featured an exaggerated recounting of the incident, painting herself as a frightened civilian who barely escaped a traumatic encounter with a weapon-wielding stranger. The stranger in question was Sarah, identified only as a woman known to be affiliated with law enforcement, as if avoiding her name somehow made the lies less defamatory. The newsletter was slipped into every mailbox in the subdivision, even taped to front doors. Karen had signed off on it as HOA president, a title she wielded like a crown. What she didn't count on was that the city council and mayor's office also received a copy, forwarded by a very irritated neighbor who wrote, "Is this what you let the HOA spend our dues on now?" The timing couldn't have been worse for Karen. That same week, Sarah was scheduled to speak at the city's public safety meeting, a high-visibility event attended by department heads, journalists, and several state representatives. And Sarah, being who she was, didn't miss the opportunity to bring the truth. Standing calmly at the podium, Sarah didn't need theatrics. She began by stating facts. She described the 911 incident, presented transcripts, showed screenshots of the newsletter, and quietly laid out her legal and constitutional rights as both a citizen and a law enforcement officer. She spoke not with bitterness but with precision, exposing how Karen's actions not only targeted her but endangered the neighborhood and misused emergency services. The room went silent as Sarah played a snippet of the 911 call where Karen's voice, high and panicked, described her as a dangerous threat with unknown intentions. That part hit hard. There was a long pause before the mayor finally asked, "And you're saying this call was made knowingly against a law-abiding officer who lives in the neighborhood?" Sarah nodded. "Not just that, sir. She knew who I was and called anyway. This wasn't fear. This was control disguised as panic." The fallout was immediate. The mayor ordered an internal review of HOA practices citywide. The city attorney began looking into the legality of neighborhood-level enforcement policies. And perhaps most satisfying of all, the HOA's vice president, Daniel Wu, reached out to Sarah privately. He apologized, explained he'd been steamrolled by Karen for over a year, and admitted she had been issuing unofficial fines and making decisions without board vote. Sarah encouraged him to come forward, and he did, submitting a written statement to the city clerk exposing Karen's rulebook as a one-woman power fantasy. But Karen still wasn't finished. She called for a special HOA board meeting at the community center and tried to spin everything into a personal attack. She claimed Sarah had an agenda and was intimidating residents into silence. Only this time, no one was buying it. During the meeting, several residents stood up and openly challenged her. An older woman named Mrs. Geller, who had lived on the block for 35 years, stood and said, "I have seen Sarah help this neighborhood more times than I can count. She helped my grandson when he got locked out. She stopped a drunk driver last year. Karen, all you do is send angry emails and hide behind your title." Karen's composure cracked. She tried to interrupt, but the room was turning on her. Another man stood up with a printout of the newsletter in hand and said, "You want to talk about safety? You lied to the police and slandered someone. That's not safety. That's reckless." Karen, now visibly sweating, accused the group of staging a mutiny. When a board member reminded her that HOA rules allowed for a no-confidence vote if requested by more than 10 residents, she laughed nervously and said, "Fine, take your vote. Let's see how loyal this neighborhood really is." The result was 28 votes to remove her, 2 to keep her, and 1 abstention. Karen stormed out, fuming. But the damage wasn't done unraveling. The next morning, Sarah received a call from Internal Affairs. While they had initially decided not to pursue charges over Karen's false report, the case had taken a new turn. The city's legal team had found multiple HOA enforcement records dating back years with Karen's personal signature on documents that should have been co-signed by board members. Many of these were tied to heavy fines or property complaints, some of which escalated to civil court. The IA officer told Sarah that the district attorney's office was opening an investigation into possible fraud and abuse of power. Meanwhile, Karen was unraveling publicly. She took to social media, posting long, rambling rants on the neighborhood forum, accusing Sarah of weaponizing the police force against a harmless civilian. She even implied that Sarah had pressured the city to launch a witch hunt. But her posts were met with ridicule and disbelief. One commenter wrote, "You literally called 911 on the chief of police for walking with a legally holstered sidearm. Sit down." Another posted a meme of Karen holding a megaphone labeled, "HOA Hysteria," with the caption, "When you realize the boss you tried to cancel has handcuffs and a badge." Trying to regain control, Karen filed a formal complaint with the city's Public Integrity Board. But the board didn't just reject her complaint. They forwarded it to the Ethics Committee with a footnote citing potential abuse of public channels for personal vendettas. Around that time, Sarah got a visit from a local news reporter who had been covering rising tensions between residents and overzealous HOA leaders across the state. Sarah agreed to a low-key interview and explained the situation in plain terms. The article went viral. Titled, "When the HOA President Tried to Police the Police Chief," it captured national attention. Karen, trying to save face, contacted the same journalist offering her side, but backed out when she learned they would ask to review the 911 transcript and HOA meeting records. At home, Sarah stayed calm, focused, and even a little amused. She knew the kind of power someone like Karen craved and how desperate people got when it slipped away. I remember sitting with her on our porch that weekend, watching neighbors walk by and wave. One by one they stopped, dropped off flowers, cookies, even thank you cards. Sarah just smiled and waved back, still quiet, still composed. But there was something in her eyes, a silent calculation, a readiness. She wasn't planning revenge. She was preparing something better. A response that didn't just correct Karen's mistake, but protected the entire neighborhood from future tyranny. That Sunday, the HOA's interim board released a public apology to the neighborhood, acknowledging the mishandling of fines and the misuse of 911 resources. They also suspended all outstanding citations issued under Karen's tenure and launched a committee to review and revise the HOA's power structure. The neighborhood felt like it had been detoxed. For the first time in years, residents felt like they could breathe without worrying about stepping on some invisible HOA tripwire. Karen, meanwhile, had gone silent. Her house lights were off for 3 days straight. Her SUV was missing from the driveway. Rumors swirled, but no one had seen her. The silence didn't last long. Just as the neighborhood began to settle into its new rhythm without Karen's constant interference, she came roaring back like a storm no one had asked for. Somehow she had managed to hire a lawyer, one of those billboard types who always looked sweaty in their own commercials, and she filed a lawsuit against Sarah personally. The claim? Defamation of character, emotional distress, and unlawful intimidation by a public official. The irony of Karen accusing Sarah of intimidation after calling 911 on her with a fabricated threat wasn't just ridiculous, it was almost impressive. Sarah laughed the moment she read the summons. It wasn't the kind of laugh that came from mockery. It was a tired, amused sigh that came from dealing with too many ridiculous things back to back. She had just finished dealing with the fallout of Karen's last move and now had to waste time and money defending herself in court against a claim that was paper-thin at best. Sarah didn't need to panic. Her brother, Evan, was a seasoned attorney who specialized in civil litigation, and when she called him, he actually sounded excited. Evan had always enjoyed dismantling bad faith lawsuits, and this one had all the classic markers. He reviewed the materials Karen's attorney had submitted and almost laughed out loud. He said the language read more like a blog post than a legal document. Sarah, ever calm, gave him the green light to handle it and went back to her job like nothing had changed. But in the background, Evan was preparing a response so thorough and sharp that it would make Karen wish she'd never heard the word defamation in her life. Meanwhile, things within the HOA were changing rapidly. With Karen officially removed as president and the board under interim leadership, the bylaws were being rewritten, and the new board had established a transparency portal where every decision had to be posted publicly with a digital vote count. It was a direct response to the behind-the-scenes manipulation Karen had become infamous for. But as with any cleanup effort, some people still held onto old loyalties. A small but loud faction in the neighborhood believed Karen had been unfairly ousted. They posted vague Facebook updates, passive-aggressive comments in group chats, and started attending meetings with sour expressions and folded arms. Sarah didn't respond to any of it. She believed in outcomes, not arguments. Karen, however, escalated once again. One night, several houses woke up to find anonymous flyers slipped under their doors. They contained a crude, heavily biased write-up of the entire incident, labeling Sarah a rogue cop with a vendetta, and claiming the new HOA leadership was puppets of law enforcement. The flyer even included a list of suspicious behaviors to report, like neighbors wearing tactical gear, running drills, or carrying weapons while jogging. Most people saw it for the nonsense it was, but one particularly nervous neighbor called the police after seeing Sarah unloading groceries while wearing her off-duty sidearm. Again. This time, the responding officer not only recognized Sarah, but had been trained by her just 2 months earlier. He knocked on our door awkwardly, apologized, and said he was required to respond, but made it clear no action would be taken. Sarah thanked him and then quietly wrote a report of her own. She was no longer interested in ignoring Karen's tactics. She was documenting them. 2 days later, another blow landed against Karen. The city's legal team had completed their review of the HOA's financial records from her time in charge, and the results were shocking. Over $75,000 were unaccounted for, most of it funneled into questionable expenses labeled as community security enhancements. These enhancements included payments to a private contractor who had no business license, no insurance, and no identifiable physical address. In short, the so-called security firm Karen had hired appeared to be a complete sham, possibly just a front she used to shuffle funds around. When confronted, Karen went full conspiracy theorist. She claimed the investigation was politically motivated, that Sarah had ordered it to destroy her reputation, and that she was being targeted because she knew too much. Her lawyer, now looking visibly drained in court appearances, tried to play it cool, but even he couldn't defend the numbers. The defamation lawsuit was beginning to fall apart under its own weight, and Sarah's legal team had just introduced new evidence. A private HOA group chat Karen had created to discuss strategy for removing dangerous influences from the community. The chat logs were damning. In them, Karen referred to Sarah repeatedly by name, mocked her, and even said, "We can't let her badge protect her. She has to go." The judge overseeing the case reviewed the documents and openly questioned the basis for Karen's claims. During one session, he looked over his glasses and asked, "Miss Franklin, are you aware that filing a knowingly false claim of defamation is itself subject to legal consequences?" Karen stuttered, tried to pivot, and mumbled something about free speech. The courtroom chuckled quietly. Her attorney asked for a recess. They never filed a continuation. The suit was dismissed within the week. But Karen's grip on reality continued to fray. She started showing up uninvited to community events, pacing along the outskirts like a specter of chaos. At one such event, a town-sponsored barbecue in the park, she brought a megaphone. Out of nowhere, she began ranting about police corruption, HOA corruption, and something about drones being used to spy on her. Children cried. Parents moved their lawn chairs. Eventually, a city marshal approached her and calmly asked her to leave. She refused. She claimed she had every right to speak freely in a public space. What she didn't realize was that the park had been reserved by the city for a public event, making her disruptive presence grounds for removal. She was escorted off the premises, again caught on camera, and again shared in the neighborhood group chat where someone captioned the footage with Karen's Greatest Hits Volume 3. At this point, Karen had become a punchline, but Sarah wasn't laughing. She was cautious, because people like Karen, when cornered and humiliated, often became desperate. Sarah began receiving emails from unfamiliar addresses, some vaguely threatening, some simply bizarre. One email accused her of orchestrating a government takeover of the HOA. Another said she was under divine judgment and would answer to a higher authority. Sarah traced the IP addresses. They led to a local coffee shop's public Wi-Fi, but one of the emails contained a signature by mistake. Karen's ex-boyfriend, who once served as her treasurer. That was enough for Sarah to request a restraining order, which was granted within 48 hours. Still, Sarah didn't let it distract her from what mattered. She used the mess to push for new training programs at the precinct on how to deal with false reporting, HOA abuse, and neighbor-on-neighbor conflict escalation. She gave talks at town hall meetings about accountability, law enforcement transparency, and civic engagement. Her story resonated with people far beyond our zip code. It was no longer just about a petty power trip. It had become a case study in how truth and integrity could dismantle corruption when backed with patience, community, and documentation. Karen, meanwhile, disappeared from public view. Her house was listed for sale within the month. The sign out front changed from "For Sale by Owner" to "Bank Owned" alarmingly fast. We later learned she had defaulted on multiple loans, including the one she'd taken out using HOA funds as leverage. It turned out she had gone all in trying to build a security empire on paranoia and control. And when it crumbled, so did her finances. By the end of the third month, Sarah was back to her peaceful morning jogs, same route, same holster, same calm smile. Only now, every wave from a neighbor felt like a salute. The woman once reported as a threat was now the most respected figure on the block. Not because she fought back with fire, but because she never let the flames consume her. And Karen, who once fancied herself queen of the cul-de-sac, was now nothing more than a story parents told their kids about what happens when power is abused and humility is ignored. Just when it seemed the neighborhood could finally breathe again without Karen lurking in the shadows, a new ripple disturbed the calm. The interim HOA board had started the process of rebuilding everything she had wrecked. They were working with the city, revising the outdated bylaws, introducing transparency, and restoring trust with residents who had grown weary of secretive rules and arbitrary fines. Sarah stayed out of the spotlight, but her quiet influence shaped the changes behind the scenes. She had no interest in revenge, but she wasn't about to let the opportunity for real reform slip away. She worked with the board to build a system that was community-led, not ego-driven. But despite her best efforts, there was one last card Karen had yet to play. It started with a tip. An anonymous envelope arrived at City Hall addressed to the mayor with a note that read, "You're letting criminals run your streets." Inside were manipulated photos of Sarah photoshopped into compromising positions with inflammatory captions. The images were laughably fake. One had her in what looked like a biker bar, another showed her allegedly vandalizing a public building. But the worst part wasn't how crude the images were. It was that someone had spent time creating them and believed they could still manipulate the narrative. Sarah's first reaction was exhaustion, not anger. She forwarded everything to internal affairs and digital forensic. Within a day, they traced the metadata back to Karen's old laptop, the one reported missing during the HOA leadership transition. That same laptop had supposedly been turned in by her during the audit process, but the serial numbers didn't match. Karen had kept the original and handed in a decoy. That was the final piece investigators needed. A warrant was issued to search Karen's storage unit, which had come up earlier in the financial investigation. What they found made everything up to this point look like child's play. Boxes of HOA property were stacked floor to ceiling, some unopened, including gardening equipment, signage, and at least 4 surveillance drones marked Neighborhood Safety Patrol. There were HOA checks, files on individual residents, and a shockingly detailed spreadsheet labeled Priority Control Targets, with names, addresses, and made-up violations like loud laughter, eye contact aggression, and potential sedition. The entire operation was surreal, as if Karen had built a shadow government based solely on paranoia and Excel spreadsheet. Sarah was brought in to review the findings. She kept her expression neutral as the evidence piled up in front of her, but I could see her jaw tighten. These weren't just violations of trust. Karen had created a full psychological profile of every resident she didn't like, including children. One document labeled Emerging Threats had the names of 3 teenage boys who often skateboard near the clubhouse. It described them as highly mobile youth units with no respect for order. It was absurd, yes, but also deeply disturbing. The city convened an emergency meeting. Karen was formally charged with multiple counts of fraud, illegal surveillance, misuse of public funds, and falsifying documents. The charges were serious enough to trigger a federal investigation into misuse of homeowners associations nationwide. Karen had officially gone from nuisance to national headline. News vans started circling the neighborhood like vultures, and reporters camped outside City Hall hoping to get a glimpse of the woman who called the cops on the police chief and ended up exposing systemic abuse in HOAs across the state. And then, like clockwork, Karen tried to spin everything in her favor. She arranged a sit-down interview with a fringe local podcast host known for conspiracy theories and unverified claims. In the interview, she painted herself as a whistleblower, claiming Sarah had been targeting her since day one and that the HOA investigation was a deep state operation designed to silence community voices. The host ate it up, nodding eagerly, asking her loaded questions, and prompting her to dig her hole even deeper. But what Karen didn't know was that the podcast's technical editor happened to be a former student of Sarah's from a law enforcement mentorship program. When he saw the raw footage and recognized Sarah's name, he immediately contacted Sarah's precinct and offered them the full unedited video, where Karen admitted to falsifying complaints and encouraged listeners to start their own community resistance plans. That footage was submitted to the district attorney, and within 48 hours, Karen was back in court, this time not as a plaintiff or neighborhood nuisance, but as a defendant facing serious jail time. Her lawyer, the same Billboard celebrity from earlier, begged the court for a plea deal. But the DA wasn't feeling generous. Too many people had been affected by Karen's actions. Elderly residents had lived in fear. Families had been fined into financial distress. Kids had been harassed for playing on sidewalk. Karen's downfall was no longer personal, it was public justice. In the neighborhood, however, something beautiful had started to grow. With Karen finally removed, people began reconnecting. The tension that had gripped everyone for years lifted like fog. Sidewalks filled with chalk art again. The park held an Easter egg hunt for the first time in 4 years. People who once ignored each other at meetings now waved and talked over fences. And in the middle of it all, Sarah remained grounded. She didn't take credit, didn't gloat, and didn't allow herself to become the new face of power. She reminded everyone that this wasn't about replacing one figurehead with another, it was about making sure no one ever had unchecked power again. That sense of humility made her more beloved than ever. One day, the new HOA board asked her to cut the ribbon on the remodeled clubhouse. She hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. The entire event was cheerful, relaxed, and refreshingly boring, exactly what the neighborhood needed. Someone brought cupcakes. Kids played tag on the lawn. There were no megaphones, no threats, no passive-aggressive speeches. Just laughter, sunshine, and the sense that maybe, just maybe, the neighborhood had finally healed. But just as the event was winding down, Sarah received a letter hand-delivered by a courier. No name. Just a plain white envelope. Inside was a single-page apology from Karen. It was messy, full of spelling mistakes, and clearly written in haste. It said things like, "I didn't realize how far I was going and I felt threatened by your confidence." It wasn't a letter of redemption, but it was something. Sarah read it once, folded it neatly, and slipped it into the back of her journal without a word. That night, as we sat on our porch watching the sun set behind the houses that no longer felt hostile, Sarah said something that stayed with me. She said, "Power doesn't always start evil. But it goes bad when no one challenges it. That's why people like Karen need people like us." I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her, remembering the months of chaos, the lawsuits, the false reports, the circus of public meltdown, and how she had stood through all of it with dignity. She didn't ask to be a symbol, but she had become one anyway. In the weeks that followed, several city council members referenced the Karen case in discussions about revising HOA laws statewide. A state senator even introduced a bill named informally after Sarah that required all HOAs to submit financial records annually to the municipal government. The ripple effect was spreading, one honest step at a time. Sarah didn't chase any of it. She simply continued doing her job, mentoring young officers, and walking her morning route with the same calm presence that had sparked Karen's panic in the first place. The real victory wasn't Karen's downfall. It was what the community built in her absence: trust, accountability, peace, and above all, a renewed understanding of what leadership should look like when it's not built on fear but on service. Sarah didn't just survive the storm. She redirected it, and the neighborhood would never forget. In the final stretch of the saga that once gripped our entire neighborhood in silent dread, something profound began to settle over the community. It wasn't triumph in the traditional sense. No one threw a parade. There were no awards or banners or grand speeches. Instead, it was the return of normalcy, the precious, often underappreciated quiet of an ordinary day. People started tending to their lawns not out of fear of fines, but because they genuinely enjoyed their space again. Porch lights flickered on in the evening with a warmth that had been missing for far too long. Kids played outside without glancing over their shoulders. Even the cranky neighbor 3 houses down started waving to people. Karen was gone, not just physically but from the center of everyone's conversations. She had become a ghost, a memory of chaos the neighborhood was eager to put behind them. Yet in her absence, her actions still echoed. The city council, motivated by the volume of public response to Karen's abuse of power, pushed forward legislation that mandated oversight for all HOAs operating within city limit. Transparency portals became law. Regular audits became compulsory. Homeowners were now granted voting power on expenditures above a certain threshold. All of it born from a single incident involving a false 911 call on a woman simply walking her dog with a holstered sidearm. What had started as a petty abuse of neighborhood control had ballooned into a statewide push for fairness and accountability. Sarah never stood on a podium to accept credit, but she had quietly been invited to speak at several leadership panels and police training academies. She turned most of them down. Not because she wasn't proud, but because she didn't want her work to be about Karen. It was about something bigger, stronger, lasting. Then one afternoon, while Sarah and I were drinking coffee on the porch, we received word from the district attorney's office. Karen had accepted a plea deal. She would serve a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation in the ongoing investigation into HOA abuse across other neighborhoods she had once advised. It turned out Karen had served on advisory boards for at least 3 other communities, spreading her methods like a disease disguised as order. The DA needed her to testify and turn over all her record. In return, she would avoid prison but would never be allowed to serve in any public or civic role again. Her name was entered into a statewide database of banned civic participants, alongside those disqualified for election fraud or public trust violations. Sarah read the statement with that same calm expression she always wore, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Closure. Not satisfaction, but resolution. Karen wouldn't be knocking on doors, or threatening neighbors, or hijacking committees anymore. She was legally exiled from the system she once weaponized. And that, more than anything, allowed us all to breathe easy. But just as we settled into this long-overdue peace, something unexpected arrived in the mail. A small, official-looking envelope with no return address showed up in our mailbox. Sarah opened it slowly, her brow furrowing slightly as she read the contents. It was from Karen's legal representative. It wasn't a threat or a challenge. It was a notice of asset liquidation. Karen had been forced to sell her house, her vehicle, and various other personal possessions to pay back restitution for misused HOA fund. The document included an inventory list. What stood out was the last item, one of the surveillance drones, labeled damaged. Underneath was a handwritten note, "For Chief Bennett with regret." There was no signature, but we both knew who it was from. Sarah stared at it for a long time, then set it aside without comment. That evening, she quietly dropped the drone into a donation box during a community tech recycling drive. She didn't want to keep a souvenir of that chapter. She just wanted it gone. The next day, she resumed her morning jog. Same route, same calm stride, same holstered sidearm. Only this time, people didn't just wave. Some clapped. One neighbor saluted. It was silent, organic respect, built not from a title but from trust. Sarah had never asked to be a symbol, but she had become one. A reminder that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it always mattered. The new HOA leadership took things further than anyone expected. They renamed the old Community Enforcement Center, a tiny, windowless office Karen had used to summon residents for scoldings and fine disputes, into a resource library. It now offered guides on neighborhood law, property rights, and resident dispute resolution. The same room once used for intimidation had become a place of empowerment. Sarah was invited to cut the ribbon at its reopening. She declined, preferring instead to attend quietly as a neighbor. When the event wrapped, several people approached her to thank her again, not just for what she did, but for how she did it with grace, restraint, and relentless patience. One particular moment stood out. A teenager who had once been wrongly fined by Karen for reckless skateboarding shyly approached Sarah and handed her a small thank you card. Inside, it read, "Thanks for proving that one person can make a difference, even when everyone's watching and waiting for them to mess up." Sarah didn't say much. Just smiled, nodded, and gave the kid a high five before walking off into the evening sun. That's just who she was. Never showy. Always steady. As weeks passed, a new sense of identity emerged in our neighborhood. People who had once kept to themselves began organizing real community events: potlucks, movie nights, gardening co-op. A chalk mural began appearing weekly on the sidewalk near the park with quotes about fairness and courage. No one took credit. No one needed to. We were all part of something again, and we liked it that way. What Karen had tried to destroy with fear and micromanagement had grown back stronger and more connected than ever. Sarah was eventually given a formal commendation by the city council. Not for surviving Karen's onslaught, but for handling it with the kind of professionalism that made the city proud to call her their chief of police. During the short ceremony, the mayor joked that if Karen had known who Sarah really was from the beginning, she probably would have picked another neighborhood to patrol with paranoia. Laughter filled the room. Sarah simply responded, "I'm glad she didn't. Otherwise, we wouldn't be standing here today, better than we were." On the one-year anniversary of the incident, the neighborhood held a quiet block celebration. No speeches, no banners, just good food, music, and neighbors enjoying each other's company. As the sun began to set, someone played a song that had become a bit of an anthem for the neighborhood during its rebuilding, an old rock ballad about standing up and pushing through. Sarah and I stood there, side by side, watching people dance and kids run around barefoot in the grass, and for the first time in a long while, we both felt the weight lift. Karen had come into our lives like a storm, threatening to uproot everything with rules and fear. But Sarah had met that storm with calm, with law, and with unshakable clarity. She didn't yell. She didn't retaliate. She documented. She endured. And when the winds died down, what remained wasn't just a neighborhood free from tyranny. It was a neighborhood that had learned how to stand up for itself, because one woman stood up first. As we walked home under a sky painted with stars, Sarah looked over at me and said, "You know, the best part of this whole mess wasn't that she lost. It's that we all finally won something back. Each other." I couldn't have said it better myself.